The letter shook in Margaret Winters' hands as the stagecoach rattled over the uneven trail leading to Cedar Ridge. The small frontier town of northeastern Colorado Territory was to be her new home, though she'd never laid eyes on it or the man she was about to marry. It was 1875, and at 22, Margaret had made the most daring decision of her life to leave behind the cramped Philadelphia boarding house where she'd worked since her parents' deaths and become a mail-order bride to a rancher in the West. "You'll be all right, miss." The gruff stagecoach driver glanced back at her with weathered eyes as they approached the outskirts of town. "Cedar Ridge ain't much, but it's growin'. Your fella's place is a ways out Quinn's ranch, right?" "Yes," Margaret nodded, tucking a loose strand of auburn hair back beneath her bonnet. "Mr. Jackson Quinn's ranch, do you know him well?" The driver chuckled. "Everyone knows Jack Quinn around these parts. Good man, hardworking, keeps to himself mostly since." He stopped abruptly, flicking the reins to urge the horses faster. "Well, you'll see soon enough." Margaret pressed her lips together, wondering what the driver had been about to say. The advertisement she'd answered had been straightforward: a cattleman seeking a bride, offering a good home and honest partnership. Jackson Quinn's letters had been brief but kind, describing his ranch, the small but sturdy house he'd built, and his hopes for a family. Not once had he mentioned any secrets or sorrows. Cedar Ridge emerged from the landscape like an afterthought, a dusty main street flanked by wooden buildings, a church spire rising above the rest. The stagecoach rolled to a stop before the general store, and Margaret stepped down, her legs stiff from the 2-day journey from Denver. "Miss Winters?" A thin man with spectacles approached, holding a ledger. "I'm Frederick Tilson, town clerk. Mr. Quinn asked me to meet you and take you to his place. He had some urgent business to attend to this morning." Margaret's heart sank slightly. She'd imagined her future husband would be the one to greet her, but she merely nodded and collected her trunk. "I'm ready whenever you are, Mr. Tilson." The clerk's wagon wasn't built for comfort, bouncing along the rutted trail leading away from town. They passed scattered homesteads and vast expanses of grazing land, the distant mountains providing a breathtaking backdrop to the open frontier. "Mr. Quinn's done well for himself," Tilson remarked as they crested a hill. "Started with almost nothing 5 years back. Got nearly 800 acres now, decent herd. Built that house himself." Below them stood a modest but well-constructed ranch house with a broad porch, a large barn, and several outbuildings. A corral held horses, and cattle dotted the distant pastures. It was more substantial than Margaret had expected, and for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she felt a flutter of hope. As they pulled into the yard, Margaret noticed the silence. No one came out to greet them. Tilson helped her down, placed her trunk on the ground, and glanced uncomfortably at the house. "I should be getting back to town," he said hurriedly. "Mr. Quinn's likely inside. Been a pleasure, Miss Winters." Before she could protest, the clerk was turning his wagon around, leaving Margaret alone in the yard. She smoothed her travel-worn dress, took a deep breath, and approached the house, her footsteps echoing on the wooden porch steps. She knocked once, then twice. No answer came, but as she pressed her ear to the door, a sound drifted out, a soft, intermittent wail that made her blood run cold. A baby's cry. Margaret tried the door handle. It turned easily, and she stepped cautiously into a simple but clean main room with a stone fireplace. The crying grew louder, coming from somewhere toward the back of the house. "Hello," she called. "Mr. Quinn." Following the sound, she moved through a doorway into a bedroom where a crude cradle sat near a window. Inside, a red-faced infant no more than a few months old was crying, tiny fists waving in distress. Margaret rushed forward instinctively, lifting the baby into her arms. "There now," she whispered, rocking gently. "What's all this fuss about, little one?" The back door banged open and heavy boots crossed the main room. Margaret turned, the baby now quieting against her shoulder, to face the man filling the doorway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and several days' worth of beard shadowing a strong jawline. His blue eyes widened in surprise, flicking from her face to the infant in her arms. "Miss Winters," he said, his voice deep and tinged with both relief and wariness. I apologize for not meeting you in town. I had to. His gaze returned to the baby, who was now contentedly gurgling against Margaret's shoulder. Mr. Quinn, she acknowledged, her mind racing with questions. I wasn't aware you had a child. The man Jackson Quinn removed his hat, revealing hair that curled slightly at the temples. There was exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes and something else, grief, perhaps. I don't, he said simply, then added, that's Matthew. He's been with me 3 days now. 3 days. Margaret's arms tightened protectively around the baby. I don't understand. Jackson Quinn moved further into the room, placing his hat on a table. His mother was my neighbor, Emma Daniels, widowed last year. She took fever 4 days ago, was gone by morning. His voice was matter of fact, but his eyes held pain. No family to speak of. I've been trying to feed him, keep him quiet enough to get ranch work done. Margaret looked down at the infant, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep against her. You've been caring for him alone. Quinn nodded, then a ghost of a smile touched his lips as he watched the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms. First time he stopped crying for more than 10 minutes since Emma passed. He met her eyes directly. Guess you were meant to be their mama. The blunt statement hung in the air between them. Margaret felt her face flush, the reality of her situation suddenly clear. She'd come to marry a rancher, not to become mother to an orphaned child. Mr. Quinn, Jack, he interrupted. Everyone calls me Jack. Jack, she amended. This is unexpected, he nodded, running a hand through his hair. I understand if this changes things for you, Miss Winters. The stagecoach heads back east tomorrow. I wouldn't hold you to our arrangement, given the circumstances. Margaret looked down at the sleeping infant, then around the simple but solid house. This was not what she had planned, not what she had imagined during those long nights in Philadelphia when she dreamed of a fresh start. But then, life rarely followed one's plans. Matthew needs to be changed, she said finally. And I suspect he's hungry. Do you have milk, clean cloths? Jack Quinn stared at her for a long moment, as if uncertain he'd heard correctly. Yes to the cloths, cow's milk in the spring house. I've been watering it down like Emma showed me once, but it doesn't seem to sit well with him. Margaret nodded. I'll need to see what you have in your pantry. We can make a more suitable mixture. She met his eyes steadily. I'm not leaving, Mr. Quinn Jack, at least not today. Relief washed over his features. I'm obliged, Miss Winters. Margaret, she corrected. If we're to be partners in this, you should use my name. Margaret, he repeated softly, and something in the way he said it made her heart beat a little faster. Thank you. The next hours passed in a blur as Margaret settled into the ranch house. Jack brought her trunk inside, showed her around the property, and explained his daily routine with the cattle and horses. The house was functional but sparse, a main room with a hearth and kitchen area, 2 bedrooms, and a small alcove off the kitchen with a wash basin. What it lacked in refinements, it made up for in craftsmanship. Every joint was tight, every floor plank smooth underfoot. By evening, Margaret had prepared a better milk mixture for Matthew, bathed the infant in a small tub, and found clean linens to serve as diapers. The baby, now fed and comfortable, slept peacefully in his cradle. Jack returned from evening chores to find Margaret at the stove, her sleeves rolled up as she stirred a pot of stew. You didn't need to cook, he said, washing his hands in the basin. You've done enough today. I was hungry, she replied simply, and I imagine you are too. They ate at the rough-hewn table, the lantern light casting warm shadows around them. Jack told her about the ranch, how he'd come west after the war, worked for other ranchers until he could buy his own land, built everything himself. He spoke of cattle prices, the nearest neighbors, the town's growth. What he didn't mention was why he'd sent for a bride or what he expected from their marriage. As they finished their meal, Margaret gathered her courage. When did you plan for us to marry? Jack looked up, his expression unreadable. I arranged with the preacher to come out day after tomorrow, but that was before. He glanced toward the bedroom where Matthew slept. We can wait if you'd prefer. Get to know each other better first. Margaret considered this. In Philadelphia, such an arrangement would be scandalous, an unmarried woman living with a man, even one to whom she was promised. But this was the frontier, where practicality often outweighed propriety. I think it best we proceed as planned, she said carefully. For Matthew's sake, if nothing else, a child needs stability. Jack studied her face. Are you certain this isn't what you signed up for? Margaret met his gaze directly. What I signed up for was a partnership, Mr. Quinn. Life here will be difficult enough without delaying the formalities. A small smile touched his lips. You're a practical woman, Margaret Winters. I've had to be, she replied simply. They lapsed into silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. Finally, Jack cleared his throat. I'll sleep in the barn tonight, he said. You can take the main bedroom, Margaret raised an eyebrow. That seems unnecessary. The house has 2 bedrooms. The second one isn't properly finished, he explained. I've been using it for storage. Was planning to complete it once you arrived, make it nice for, he stopped, looking slightly embarrassed. For children, Margaret finished for him. Well, it seems we already have one, so perhaps we should prioritize finishing it. Jack nodded, something like admiration flickering in his eyes. First thing tomorrow, but tonight I'll take the barn. Margaret didn't argue further. Despite her practical words, she needed time to adjust to this new reality. A night alone would give her space to think, to consider what she'd committed herself to. After Jack left for the barn, Margaret prepared for bed, washing up and changing into her nightgown. She checked on Matthew, still sleeping soundly, before climbing into the large bed that would soon be hers and Jack's. The thought sent a flutter of nerves through her stomach. She'd never known a man intimately. Her parents had died when she was 18, leaving her with no dowry and few prospects in Philadelphia's competitive marriage market. 4 years of working in the boarding house had only reinforced her desire to escape, to find a place where she could build something of her own. Now here she was, in a strange bed, in a house belonging to a man she barely knew, with an orphaned baby sleeping nearby. It wasn't the fresh start she'd imagined, but perhaps it could still be the new beginning she needed. Margaret woke before dawn to Matthew's hungry cries. She fed him, changed him, and was preparing breakfast when Jack entered from outside, his hair damp from washing at the pump. You're up early, he noted, accepting the coffee she offered. Matthew decided morning starts at first light, she replied with a small smile. I've fed him, but he'll need more milk soon. Do you have a cow I can learn to milk, or do you buy it from somewhere? I have 2 milk cows, Jack said. I'll show you after breakfast. The day passed in a flurry of activity. Jack showed Margaret around the ranch, properly the vegetable garden behind the house that needed attention, the chicken coop with a dozen laying hens, the spring house where milk and butter were kept cool, the barn with its 2 milk cows, 4 work horses, and Jack's personal mount, a handsome black gelding named Scout. Margaret learned to milk the gentle Jersey cow while Jack held Matthew. She gathered eggs, helped weed the neglected garden, and made lists of supplies they needed from town. By midday, her hands were dirty and her back ached, but she felt oddly satisfied. While Matthew napped in the afternoon, Jack showed her the second bedroom and they began clearing it out together, moving tools and supplies to the barn or storage shed. I thought we could paint it, Jack said, almost shyly. Make it nice for Matthew, got some whitewash in the shed. Margaret nodded, touched by his consideration. That would be lovely. Perhaps we could ask for a proper crib in town. The cradle is fine for now, but he'll outgrow it soon. They worked side by side, the initial awkwardness between them easing as they focused on practical tasks. Jack was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. The gentle way he handled Matthew, the care he took to explain things to Margaret, the respect with which he considered her suggestions. By evening, the room was cleared and swept clean, ready for its transformation. Over another simple dinner, they discussed plans for the next day. The preacher would arrive in the afternoon, and they would need to prepare for the wedding. It won't be much of a ceremony, Jack apologized. Just us, the preacher, and my closest neighbor James Harker as witness. I didn't expect anything elaborate, Margaret assured him. Though I would like to wear my good dress if you don't mind waiting while I press it, Jack nodded. Of course, and maybe, he hesitated, looking uncharacteristically uncertain, maybe we could plant something afterward. A tree or some flowers, to mark the day. Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest at this unexpected gesture of sentimentality from the stoic rancher. "I'd like that very much." That night, Jack again insisted on sleeping in the barn despite Margaret's protests that it was unnecessary. As she lay in bed, listening to Matthew's soft breathing from his cradle, Margaret reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. In just 2 days, she would be Mrs. Margaret Quinn, wife to a rancher and mother to an orphaned child. It wasn't the life she had imagined, but she was beginning to think it might be one she could embrace. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright. Margaret rose early to feed Matthew and complete her chores before preparing herself for the ceremony. She washed her hair and pinned it up in a simple but elegant style, then carefully unpacked and pressed her best dress, a deep blue wool with delicate lace trim at the collar and cuffs. As she dressed, she pinned her mother's cameo brooch at her throat, the one possession she'd kept when they'd had to sell everything else to pay for her parents' medical bills and funerals. She looked at her reflection in the small mirror Jack had hung for her the previous day and barely recognized herself. The pale, tired young woman from Philadelphia was gone, replaced by someone with more color in her cheeks and a determined set to her jaw. Outside, she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Jack had ridden to the neighboring ranch at dawn to bring back James Harker, and now they were returning with the preacher. Margaret took a deep breath, picked up Matthew, who was dressed in the cleanest clothes she could fashion for him, and stepped out onto the porch. Jack stood by the wagon, dressed in what was clearly his Sunday best dark trousers, a white shirt with no fraying at the cuffs, and a clean black vest. He'd trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair, and when he saw Margaret, he stared as if seeing her for the first time. "You look beautiful," he said simply, the sincerity in his voice making her blush. 2 other men climbed down from the wagon, a tall, lanky man with graying temples who introduced himself as James Harker, and a shorter, round-faced man in a black coat who was Reverend Thomas Porter. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Winters," the preacher said warmly. "Or should I say, the soon-to-be Mrs. Quinn." They gathered in the main room of the house, standing before the stone fireplace. Margaret had placed wildflowers in a jar on the mantel, a small attempt to bring beauty to the occasion. Matthew, miraculously, remained quiet in James Harker's arms as the ceremony began. The words were traditional and brief. Jack's hands were steady as he placed a simple gold band on Margaret's finger, a ring he later told her had belonged to his mother. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Jack hesitated only a moment before leaning forward to place a chaste kiss on Margaret's lips. It was her first kiss, and though it lasted only seconds, Margaret felt a tingling warmth spread through her. Jack's eyes, when he pulled away, held a question she wasn't yet ready to answer. After the ceremony, James Harker presented them with a gift, a small apple tree sapling. "For your future," he said with a smile, "may it grow strong like your marriage." They planted it together at the side of the house where it would get morning sun, Jack digging the hole while Margaret held Matthew. The preacher said a blessing over the tree and the new family before he and James departed, leaving the newlyweds alone as evening approached. Dinner that night was quiet, both of them aware of the shift in their relationship. As Margaret cleared the dishes, Jack stoked the fire, then turned to face her. "I meant what I said yesterday," he told her, his voice low. "Nothing needs to happen that you're not ready for." Margaret dried her hands slowly on a dish towel. "We're married now," she said, meeting his gaze steadily. "I'm your wife." "Yes," he agreed, "but I won't rush you. This isn't how either of us planned things to be." She appreciated his consideration, but also recognized the practical reality of their situation. They were married. They lived in a small house. There was only one proper bedroom. And beyond the practical concerns, she couldn't deny the flutter in her stomach when he looked at her, or the way her skin had tingled when his lips touched hers. "I'm not afraid," she told him, though it wasn't entirely true. She was afraid not of Jack, but of her own inexperience, of disappointing him, of the unknown. Jack stepped closer, reaching out to touch her cheek gently. "I'll never hurt you, Margaret, that's a promise." Later, when Matthew was asleep, and the house was dark except for the low glow of the bedroom lamp, Margaret discovered that Jack Quinn was a man who kept his promises. His hands were calloused but gentle, his patience seemingly endless as he guided her through the intimacies of marriage with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. When they finally joined as husband and wife, the discomfort she'd expected was brief, soon replaced by sensations she'd never imagined possible. Afterward, lying in his arms, Margaret marveled at the strange path that had led her here to this bed, this man, this life. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The following weeks brought a rhythm to their lives. Margaret gradually took over management of the household, cooking, cleaning, tending the garden, and caring for Matthew. Jack taught her to milk the cows and collect eggs, to make butter and preserve vegetables. She learned quickly, determined to be a true partner in their shared enterprise. Matthew thrived under their care, growing plumper and more alert each day. His first real smile came one morning when Jack was making faces at him during breakfast, and Margaret had never seen such pride on her husband's face as in that moment. "He has Emma's eyes," Jack observed quietly. "Same shade of brown," Margaret nodded, having noticed the same thing. "We should tell him about her when he's older, make sure he knows she loved him." Jack reached across the table and squeezed her hand, a simple gesture that had become his way of expressing affection. "You're a good woman, Margaret Quinn." They settled into a companionable partnership, learning each other's habits and preferences. Jack was early to rise and early to bed, meticulous about his tools but careless with his clothes. Margaret was organized and efficient, with an unexpected talent for numbers that Jack discovered when she took over the ranch accounts and immediately identified ways to reduce their expenses. Physical intimacy between them grew more comfortable, more natural, though Jack never pressed if Margaret was too tired from caring for Matthew. He was a considerate husband in all ways, but sometimes Margaret sensed a reserve in him, as if he were holding part of himself back. The truth emerged one evening about a month after their wedding. Matthew was asleep, and they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and purple. Jack had been quieter than usual all day, and Margaret had noticed him looking at Matthew with a particular sadness in his eyes. "Today would have been my son's 3rd birthday," he said suddenly, his voice rough. Margaret turned to him, startled. "Your son?" Jack nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "His name was Samuel. He and my wife Sarah died 2 years ago, cholera." Margaret's heart clenched with understanding. "That's why you sent for a bride, why you took in Matthew." Jack's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. "Sarah was pregnant when we came west. We had such dreams, a big family, children running around this ranch. Samuel was born our first year here. He was perfect." His voice broke slightly. "When the cholera came, it took them both in 3 days. I buried them under the cottonwood tree by the creek." Margaret reached for his hand, holding it tightly. "I'm so sorry, Jack. I thought I'd die too," he continued, as if needing to get the words out now that he'd started. "Wanted to for a while, then one day I realized Sarah would have been furious with me for giving up on everything we'd built. So I kept going, but the house was so empty." He turned to look at Margaret, his blue eyes shining with unshed tears. "When Emma died and left Matthew alone, it felt like a sign, and then you arrived that same day and you held him like you'd been doing it forever." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I'd already decided to ask the Harkers to take him if you didn't want to stay, couldn't bear to see another child sent to an orphanage." "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Margaret asked gently. Jack shrugged. "Didn't want your pity. Or for you to feel obligated to stay because of what I'd lost." Margaret considered this. "Do you regret marrying me? Do you feel you've betrayed Sarah's memory?" "No," Jack said firmly. "Sarah would have liked you. She was practical like you, didn't waste words or time." He squeezed her hand. "I'm grateful you stayed, Margaret, more than I can say." She leaned against his shoulder, understanding now the shadows that sometimes crossed his face when he looked at Matthew or entered the second bedroom they were preparing for the baby. "Thank you for telling me." They sat in silence as darkness fell, a deeper understanding growing between them. That night, their lovemaking had a new dimension, a tenderness born of shared confidences, of barriers lowered and trust deepened. As summer progressed into fall, life on the ranch grew busier. Jack was often away from dawn until dusk, working with the cattle, mending fences, and preparing for winter. Margaret took full charge of the household, putting up preserves, drying herbs, and sewing warm clothes for the coming cold months. Matthew reached milestone after milestone, rolling over, sitting up, babbling his first sounds that might one day become words. His first tooth appeared in September, leading to fretful nights that left both Margaret and Jack bleary-eyed but determined not to complain. One evening in early October, as the aspens were turning golden on the mountainsides, Margaret stood at the stove stirring a pot of stew when Jack came in from his day's work. "Something smells good," he said, coming up behind her to place a kiss on her neck. Margaret leaned back against him briefly, savoring the contact. Over the months, they had grown more comfortable with such casual affection, and she had come to crave his touch. "Just a simple stew, but I made apple pie for dessert. The first apples from the Harkers' orchard were ready." Jack smiled, moving to wash his hands at the basin. "James mentioned they'd be harvesting soon. Did Matthew behave himself today?" "Mostly," Margaret replied, adding a pinch of salt to the stew, "though he's determined to crawl. Keeps getting up on his hands and knees, then tips over and gets frustrated. Stubborn like his mama," Jack teased, drying his hands. The words were spoken lightly, but they struck Margaret with unexpected force. His mama. Was that what she had become to Matthew? She had been caring for him, loving him for nearly 4 months now. When had he transformed from an orphaned child she'd agreed to raise into her son? Jack noticed her silence. "Margaret, did I say something wrong?" She shook her head, blinking back sudden tears. "No. It just occurred to me that I do think of him as mine as ours. I can hardly remember a time when he wasn't." Jack's expression softened, and he crossed to where Matthew sat in the wooden high chair Jack had crafted for him. The baby gurgled happily at the sight of him, reaching up with pudgy hands. "Course he's ours," Jack said, lifting Matthew and settling him on his hip with practiced ease. "Has been since the day you arrived." Margaret nodded, struck by how natural they looked together, her husband and son. Because that's what they were now, these two males who had so unexpectedly become the center of her world. "I love you both," she said softly, the words emerging before she'd fully formed the thought. Jack looked up sharply, his eyes widening. It was the first time either of them had spoken of love. Their marriage had begun as a practical arrangement, evolving into mutual respect, partnership, and physical affection. But love, that had remained unspoken, perhaps uncertain. "Margaret," Jack said, his voice rough with emotion. He crossed to her, Matthew still in his arms, and pulled her against him with his free arm. "I've loved you since the day you decided to stay, knowing full well what a mess you were walking into." She pressed her face against his chest, inhaling the scent of him, leather and hay and the crisp October air. "It's not a mess, it's a life, our life." That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Margaret whispered her deepest fear to Jack. "What if I'm not a good mother to him? I never knew my own mother well, she was always working, I have no example to follow." Jack pulled her closer. "You're already a good mother, you love him, you care for him, you want what's best for him, that's all any child really needs. But what about when he's older? When he asks about his real mother," Jack was quiet for a moment. "Emma will always be the woman who gave him life, who loved him first. We'll honor her memory, tell him about her. But you, Margaret, you're the mother who's raising him, who'll teach him and guide him. That makes you as real a mother as any child could have." Margaret nodded against his shoulder, comforted by his words. "And you're a wonderful father. The way you are with him, it's beautiful to watch." Jack's arms tightened around her. "Never thought I'd have this chance again. After Samuel," he paused, his voice catching. "Having Matthew, having you, it's a gift I never expected." As winter descended on the ranch, bringing snow and biting winds, the Quinn household grew ever closer. The cold kept them indoors more, giving Jack time to work on projects around the house, building shelves for Margaret's growing collection of preserves, crafting a small wooden horse for Matthew's Christmas gift, finally finishing the second bedroom that would one day be the boys'. Christmas was a simple but joyful affair. They exchanged modest gifts: a new shirt Margaret had sewn for Jack, a pretty comb he'd purchased in town for her hair, and the wooden horse for Matthew, who was more interested in the colorful ribbon it was wrapped with than the toy itself. The Harkers joined them for Christmas dinner, bringing more apples, fresh bread, and the welcome company of their 3 children, who cooed over Matthew and promised to teach him to ride as soon as he was old enough. "You've made a real home here," Laura Harker told Margaret as they washed dishes together after the meal. "Jack's a different man than he was a year ago. There's light in his eyes again." Margaret glanced through the doorway to where Jack sat by the fire, Matthew dozing on his chest while he talked cattle prices with James. "He's a good man, I'm fortunate," Laura smiled knowingly. "It's more than good fortune, my dear. It's what happens when 2 people decide to build something together, even when it starts from unexpected circumstances." January brought the coldest days of the year, with temperatures that kept them close to the hearth. February saw Matthew's first real attempts at crawling, leading Jack to spend evenings securing furniture and moving dangerous items to higher shelves. In March, as the first signs of spring appeared in small green shoots pushing through the snow, Margaret woke one morning with a strange queasiness. She managed to prepare breakfast for Jack before he left for the day's work, but by mid-morning she found herself retching into a basin while Matthew watched with concerned eyes from his play area on the floor. The sickness continued for several days, always worst in the mornings. Margaret tried to hide it from Jack, not wanting to worry him, but by the 4th day he confronted her. "You're ill," he stated, watching her push food around her plate at dinner. "We should get the doctor from town." Margaret shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "I don't think that's necessary," Jack frowned. "Margaret, you've been sick every morning, I've heard you." She reached across the table to take his hand. "Jack, I'm not ill, at least not in the way you're thinking." She took a deep breath. "I believe I'm with child." The fork in Jack's other hand clattered to the plate. "A baby, our baby," Margaret nodded, her eyes filling with tears at the expression on his face, wonder mixed with joy and a touch of fear. "I won't know for certain for another month or so, but all the signs are there." Jack was around the table in an instant, pulling her up into his arms and holding her as if she were made of glass. "A baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion, "our own child." Margaret held him tight, understanding the complex emotions he must be feeling: happiness for this new life, memories of the child he'd lost, perhaps fear of losing another. "I'm healthy," she assured him, "and we'll take every precaution." Jack nodded against her hair. "We'll get a proper doctor out here, no midwife from town, the best care." "Jack," she said gently, pulling back to look at him, "women have babies on the frontier every day. I'll be careful, but we can't live in fear." He cupped her face in his hands. "I can't lose you, Margaret, not you too." The naked vulnerability in his eyes made her heart ache. "You won't," she promised, though she knew it was a promise beyond her power to keep absolutely. Life was uncertain, especially on the frontier, but she was determined to face it with courage rather than fear. As spring progressed, Margaret's condition became more certain. Her dresses grew tighter around the middle, and the morning sickness gradually subsided, replaced by a ravenous appetite that amused Jack to no end. "Never seen anyone put away food like you do these days," he teased one evening as she helped herself to a 3rd serving of stew. Margaret mock glared at him. "I'm eating for 2, remember?" "At this rate, it might be 3, he suggested, ducking when she tossed a piece of bread at his head. Matthew, now nearly 10 months old, was crawling everywhere and pulling himself up on furniture, keeping both Margaret and Jack constantly alert. His first word came in April, "Ma ma," directed unmistakably at Margaret as she picked him up from his nap. She'd cried, overwhelmed by the simple syllables that confirmed what her heart already knew. She was his mother in every way that mattered. In May, as the ranch burst into spring greenery and the cattle moved to higher pastures, Jack hired a young ranch hand named Thomas to help with the daily work. "You're doing too much," he told Margaret firmly. "With Thomas helping outside, I can be around more, take some of the burden off you." Margaret hadn't complained, but she was grateful for the help. As her belly grew, simple tasks became more challenging. and Matthew's increasing mobility meant she was constantly chasing after him. One evening in early June, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Matthew already asleep inside, Jack took Margaret's hand and placed it over his heart. "I've been thinking," he said quietly. "About names for the baby," Margaret smiled, resting her other hand on the swell of her stomach. "I've been thinking about that too. If it's a boy," Jack continued, "I'd like to name him after my father, William. Good, strong name." "William Quinn," Margaret tested the name on her tongue. "I like it, and if it's a girl," Jack was silent for a moment. "I thought maybe Sarah." After he stopped, looking uncertain, Margaret squeezed his hand. "After your first wife, I think that's beautiful, Jack, a way to honor her memory." Relief crossed his features. "You wouldn't mind?" "Of course not," Margaret said sincerely. "She was important to you, part of what made you the man I love. Our daughter could have no better namesake." Jack pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "How did I get so lucky twice in one lifetime?" "Not luck," Margaret corrected gently. "Just life with all its unexpected turns, some tragic, some wonderful." The summer progressed, hot and occasionally dry, keeping Jack busy ensuring the cattle had enough water and grazing land. Margaret's pregnancy advanced steadily, her belly growing large enough that Matthew could no longer sit comfortably on her lap, much to his dismay. In August, with the baby due in about a month, Jack insisted on having the doctor from Denver make the journey to examine Margaret. Dr. Wilson was a kindly older man who pronounced both mother and baby healthy, but advised Margaret to rest more in the coming weeks. "The baby's positioned well," he assured them. "But first births can be unpredictable. Best to conserve your strength, Mrs. Quinn." Jack took the doctor's words to heart, practically forbidding Margaret from doing anything more strenuous than reading or light sewing. Laura Harker came by twice a week to help with heavier household tasks, and between her and Jack, Margaret found herself with more leisure time than she'd had since arriving at the ranch. "I'm not an invalid," she protested one afternoon when Jack insisted on carrying a basket of laundry for her. "Women work right up until their time all across this territory." "Not my wife," Jack said firmly. "Dr. Wilson said rest, and rest you shall." Margaret sighed but secretly appreciated his concern. The August heat was oppressive, making her uncomfortable and irritable. Matthew, now walking with the assistance of furniture, required constant vigilance, a task Jack took on with surprising patience when he wasn't working with the cattle. As September approached, the ranch prepared for the fall roundup. Jack was torn between the need to work with the cattle and his desire to stay close to home as Margaret's time drew near. "Go," she insisted. "Thomas can't manage it alone, and we need the income from those cattle. The baby won't come for at least another week, according to Dr. Wilson." Reluctantly, Jack agreed to join the roundup, but made Laura Harker promise to stay at the ranch during the days he would be gone. "And if anything at all seems amiss, James will ride for me immediately," he instructed. The first 3 days of Jack's absence passed uneventfully. Margaret enjoyed Laura's company and the help with Matthew, though she missed Jack's presence in the house. On the 4th morning, she woke before dawn with a strange cramping sensation across her lower back. "Just false pains," Laura reassured her when Margaret mentioned it over breakfast. "Common in the last weeks. Try walking a bit, that often helps." Margaret nodded, but something told her these weren't false pains. She said nothing, not wanting to alarm Laura unnecessarily, but as the morning progressed, the cramping intensified and began to wrap around to her abdomen in unmistakable waves. By noon, there was no denying what was happening. "Laura," Margaret said calmly as the older woman fed Matthew his midday meal, "I think you should send for Jack, and Dr. Wilson if there's time." Laura looked up sharply. "The baby's coming," Margaret nodded, gripping the back of a chair as another pain washed over her. "Yes. And I think it's coming quickly." Laura sprang into action, sending her eldest son, who had accompanied her that day, galloping toward the roundup camp to fetch Jack. There was no time to send for the doctor in Denver. The baby would arrive long before he could make the journey. "Don't worry," Laura assured Margaret as she helped her to the bedroom. "I've birthed 3 of my own and helped with half a dozen others. We'll manage just fine." The next hours passed in a blur of pain for Margaret. The contractions came faster and stronger than she had anticipated, leaving her gasping and clutching at the bedsheets. Laura moved with calm efficiency, preparing clean linens, boiling water, and keeping Matthew occupied in the other room. "You're progressing quickly," Laura informed her after checking her condition. "First babies usually take longer, but yours is in a hurry to meet you." Margaret managed a weak smile between contractions, like his father always rushing. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret began to worry that Jack wouldn't make it back in time. The roundup camp was several hours' ride away, and even if James's son had reached him quickly, it would take time for Jack to return. "I want Jack," she whispered during a brief respite between pains. "He should be here." Laura squeezed her hand. "He'll move heaven and earth to get back to you, my dear, but babies come on their own schedule, not ours." The sun was setting when the most intense contractions yet seized Margaret, and Laura announced it was time to push. Gathering her remaining strength, Margaret bore down, driven by instinct and Laura's calm instructions. "I can see the head," Laura exclaimed. "Dark hair just like Jack's. One more push, Margaret." With a final, tremendous effort, Margaret pushed, feeling the baby slip from her body in a rush of relief and euphoria. A moment later, a lusty cry filled the room. "A girl," Laura announced, tears in her eyes as she quickly wrapped the infant in a clean cloth. "A beautiful, perfect little girl." Margaret reached out with trembling arms, and Laura placed the tiny bundle against her chest. The baby's cries quieted as Margaret held her close, marveling at the perfect little face, the dark hair plastered to her head, the tiny fingers curling and uncurling. "Sarah," Margaret whispered, touching the baby's cheek gently. "Welcome to the world, Sarah Quinn." The door to the bedroom burst open, and Jack stood there, still in his dusty riding clothes, his face pale with worry and exertion. "Margaret," she looked up, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Come meet your daughter." Jack moved to the bedside as if in a dream, sinking to his knees beside Margaret. His hand shook as he gently touched the baby's head. "She's so small," he whispered. "But strong," Laura assured him, busy with the afterbirth and cleaning up. "Came into this world in quite a hurry, just like her papa returning home." Jack looked from the baby to Margaret, his eyes filled with a mix of love, relief, and lingering fear. "I thought I wouldn't make it. When Robert reached us with the news, I've never ridden so hard in my life." Margaret reached out to touch his cheek. "You're here now. We're all here together." Laura discreetly withdrew to check on Matthew, leaving the new parents alone with their daughter. Jack climbed carefully onto the bed beside Margaret, one arm around her shoulders, the other hand gently cradling his daughter's head. "Sarah," he said softly, testing the name. "It suits her?" Margaret leaned against him, exhausted but happier than she'd ever been. "I thought perhaps Sarah Margaret, if you approve, for both of her mothers." Jack's arm tightened around her. "It's perfect. She's perfect." He pressed a kiss to Margaret's damp forehead. "You're incredible. I've never been so terrified or so proud in all my life." They sat together as twilight deepened outside the window, a family expanded by one more precious life. When Laura brought Matthew in to meet his sister, the little boy approached the bed cautiously, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Baby," he said, one of the few words in his growing vocabulary. "Yes, Matthew," Margaret smiled. "Your baby sister, Sarah." Matthew reached out a tentative finger to touch the infant's hand, breaking into a delighted grin when Sarah's tiny fingers reflexively closed around his. Jack lifted him onto the bed, and for the first time, all 4 members of the Quinn family were together. Later, after Laura had departed with promises to return the next day, and Matthew was asleep in his crib in the newly finished second bedroom, Jack and Margaret lay side by side, Sarah sleeping between them. "I never imagined this," Jack said quietly, his finger tracing the curve of Sarah's cheek. "After losing Samuel and Sarah, I thought that part of my life was over forever. I sent for a bride because I needed help with the ranch, because I was lonely. I never expected," he gestured to the sleeping infant, to Margaret, to the home they'd created together. "All of this." Margaret reached across their daughter to take his hand. "Life takes unexpected turns. A year ago, I was a spinster in Philadelphia with no prospects and no future. Now I'm a wife, a mother of 2 children, mistress of a ranch." She smiled softly. "None of it was planned, but I wouldn't change a moment." Jack brought her hand to his lips. "I love you, Margaret Quinn, more than I have words to say." "And I love you," she replied simply. "For the man you are, for the father you are to our children, for the life we're building together." Outside the window, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, shining down on the ranch where a most unusual family had found their way to each other through circumstance, choice, and ultimately, love. 5 years passed in the blink of an eye. The Quinn Ranch prospered, expanding its herd and adding new pastureland. The apple tree planted on their wedding day bore fruit each autumn, just as their marriage had borne the fruits of partnership, respect, and deepening love. Matthew grew into a sturdy, thoughtful 6-year-old with Emma's brown eyes and a quiet dignity beyond his years. Sarah, now 5, was her father's shadow, following him everywhere on the ranch, already showing an aptitude for horses that made Jack burst with pride. And 3-year-old William, born 2 years after Sarah, had his mother's auburn hair and his father's determined jawline. On the 6th anniversary of Margaret's arrival at the ranch, the family gathered on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the Colorado sky in brilliant hues of gold and crimson. Jack sat with his arm around Margaret, who held sleepy William on her lap. Matthew and Sarah played a game of checkers on a small table nearby, their heads bent in concentration. "Do you ever think about that day?" Jack asked quietly. "The day you stepped off that stagecoach and found a baby crying in a strange house," Margaret smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "Often, how terrified I was, how uncertain," Jack chuckled. "You didn't look terrified, you looked like you belonged here with Matthew in your arms." "I didn't feel that way inside," she admitted, "but something told me to stay, to give this strange arrangement a chance." She looked around at their children, their home, the life they'd built together. "I'm glad I listened to that voice." Jack pressed a kiss to her temple. "Remember what I said that first day, that you were meant to be their mama?" "I remember," Margaret nodded. "I thought you were presumptuous." "I was desperate," Jack corrected with a laugh. "Terrified you'd turn around and get right back on that stagecoach." "Never," Margaret said firmly. "Even then, something about this place felt like home." She paused, watching as Matthew triumphantly captured one of Sarah's checkers, earning an indignant protest from his sister. "They're good children, aren't they?" "The best," Jack agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "Matthew's already talking about going to school in town next year." "Can't believe he's old enough." Margaret nodded. They'd been teaching the children at home, but soon Matthew would need more education than they could provide. "He'll do well. He's smart, conscientious." "Gets that from his mama," Jack said, squeezing her shoulders. Margaret smiled, knowing he meant her, not Emma. Over the years, they'd kept Emma's memory alive for Matthew, showing him the few photographs they had of her, telling him stories of the kind, brave woman who had given him life. But Margaret was the only mother he truly remembered, the one who had bandaged his scrapes, taught him his letters, held him through nightmares and illness. "I've been thinking," Jack said after a moment, "about expanding the house, adding a proper second floor with more bedrooms. The children are getting bigger," and he hesitated, a smile playing at his lips. "Well, we might need the space." Margaret turned to him, her eyes widening. "Jack Quinn, are you saying what I think you're saying?" He grinned. "Doctor, Wilson mentioned when he was here last month that you were showing the same signs as before. I've been waiting for you to say something." Margaret laughed softly. "I was going to tell you tonight. I'm almost certain we'll be welcoming another Quinn come spring." Jack's hand moved to rest on her still flat stomach, his expression one of wonder despite having experienced this twice before. "Another child," he murmured. "Our family keeps growing." "Like this ranch," Margaret agreed, looking out over the land that had become so dear to her. "From humble beginnings to something strong and enduring." Jack tightened his arm around her. "I thank God every day for sending you to us, Margaret, for giving me a second chance at happiness." "And I thank him for leading me here," she replied, her heart full as she watched their children play in the fading light. "To this place, to you, to the family we've built together." As twilight deepened into night, Jack gathered William into his arms, and they all moved inside. Margaret paused in the doorway, looking back at the land stretching away toward the distant mountains. 6 years ago, she'd arrived a stranger to this wild, beautiful place, uncertain of her future, and the man she'd agreed to marry. Now it was home in every sense of the word, the place where she'd found love, purpose, and a family that had grown from the most unexpected beginning. A mail-order bride, an orphaned baby, a grieving rancher, 3 strangers brought together by circumstance, now bound forever by choice and love. Margaret smiled and closed the door, returning to the warmth of the home and the family that awaited her inside.